The wind cut sharp across the open fields of northern Nevada, where the mountains stood silent and the snow fell heavy like a thick white blanket burying the past. Earl McKinney stepped out from the shadows of his weather-worn barn, his breath turning to fog in the freezing morning air. At 73, Earl had long grown used to the silence of winter, the kind of silence that settles in the bones, deep, aching, and familiar. His hands, covered in cracked leather gloves, trembled slightly as he pulled his coat tighter against his chest. Life on the ranch hadn't been easy since Mabel died, and since Clint left. These days, the snow was his only company. That morning, something caught his eye, movement out near the tree line. He squinted past the falling snow. 3 shapes emerged slowly from the white, 1 tall, 2 small. Horses. A mare and 2 foals, stumbling, starved, their bodies trembling from cold. Earl didn't move. He watched as they came closer, step by slow, painful step. Their eyes were hollow, coats crusted with ice. He had no idea where they'd come from. Wild horses rarely came down this far in the winter. But something about them didn't feel wild. Without a word, Earl opened the barn doors wider. The mare hesitated, then stepped forward. The foals followed. Once inside, the warmth of the barn wrapped around them like an old quilt. Earl scattered the last of his stored hay across the floor, along with a few broken carrots. He knew he couldn't afford to feed them. But something about the way the smallest one, pale, with wide, alert eyes, looked at him, made the decision for him. He named her Luna. The bigger one, all legs and clumsy steps, became Buck. And the mare, he called her Whisper. That night, Earl didn't go back to the house. He stayed in the barn, wrapped in a wool blanket, sitting on an overturned bucket as the horses rested nearby. The storm outside roared on, but inside it was calm, the kind of calm that hadn't touched him in years. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel entirely alone. Whisper, the mare, seemed to know he was watching. She met his gaze without fear, as if she'd seen men like him before, tired, broken, but not completely gone. The next morning, Earl noticed something strange. Just outside the barn door, pressed clearly into the snow, was a single horseshoe print, larger than the others. And beside it, a faint mark. A brand. One he hadn't seen in decades. A chill ran through him, deeper than the cold. That brand had belonged to a man he'd buried in his memory long ago. And suddenly, the past he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget, started knocking on the door. Earl stood frozen at the edge of the barn, staring down at the horseshoe print in the snow. The wind had died down, leaving the world eerily still, like it was holding its breath. He crouched to take a closer look. The curve of the iron imprint was wide, heavy, not like Whisper's smaller, worn shoes. Then his eyes locked on the brand mark pressed next to it. Faded but unmistakable, a jagged R inside a broken circle. Earl's breath caught in his throat. That brand hadn't been seen in these parts for over 30 years. And the man who used it, Royce Denton, had been buried in both the ground and Earl's conscience since the spring of '92. The Denton ranch had burned to the ground the night Royce disappeared. Rumors spread like wildfire. Cattle theft, debts, maybe even murder. But no body was ever found. Earl had kept his mouth shut through it all, even when people whispered that he knew more than he let on. Truth was, he did. Royce Denton was the last man to hurt someone Earl loved. Mabel never spoke of that night again. And Earl had spent the rest of his life trying not to remember it. Yet now, here was Royce's brand, staring back at him from the snow. It didn't make sense. Was someone using it again? Or had the past finally clawed its way back through the snowdrifts? He rose slowly and turned to Whisper, now watching him from the stall. Her breath puffed softly in the cold air. She didn't flinch when he stepped closer, just blinked, calm, knowing. Earl reached out and ran his gloved hand gently down her neck. "Where'd you come from, girl?" he muttered almost to himself. Whisper leaned into his touch, and for a brief moment Earl felt like he was speaking to more than just a horse. Like the universe was trying to tell him something, only he didn't know the language anymore. Later that afternoon, Earl hitched up his old Ford pickup and drove into town. The snow had started to melt slightly under the midday sun, turning the dirt roads into slush. At the sheriff's office, Hank Bodie was sipping stale coffee and flipping through a fishing magazine when Earl walked in. The two men hadn't talked much since Clint left town, but there was still a quiet respect between them, the kind that came from surviving the same wars, both inside and out. Earl laid the photo he'd taken of the brand on Hank's desk. "You ever seen this show up again?" he asked. Hank studied it, frowning. "Not in a long time. Thought we'd buried all that." "I thought so too," Earl said quietly. That night, back at the ranch, Earl couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the eaves of the barn. Buck and Luna were restless, pacing lightly in their stalls. Whisper, however, stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the door like she was waiting for someone. And Earl had the strange, uneasy feeling that someone was coming. Morning light struggled to break through the gray clouds over Earl's ranch, casting a pale silver hue across the snow-covered fields. Inside the barn, the horses were already stirring. Luna let out a soft whinny, followed by Buck nudging at the feed bucket with his nose. Whisper remained quiet, her ears twitching slightly, eyes still focused on the door. Earl had barely slept. He sat on a wooden stool near the stall, thermos of black coffee in his hands, his mind chewing on the same thought over and over. Why had Royce Denton's brand reappeared? And what did these horses have to do with it? After feeding them, Earl walked out toward the ridge behind the barn, the same trail he hadn't set foot on in years. The snow crunched under his boots as he followed the faint tracks left near the brand. The further he walked, the more he felt a gnawing weight in his chest. Not from the cold, but from memory. That trail had once led to a fence line shared with the old Denton property, before the fire. Earl paused at the hilltop, looking across the valley. The remains of Royce's place were nothing but collapsed beams and brittle metal now, half buried under decades of dirt and frost. But standing there, Earl could almost hear the shouting again. The gunshot. Mabel crying on the porch. The night everything broke. He turned back before the ghosts got too loud. Back at the ranch, Grace Turner's old Jeep rattled up the driveway just before noon. Earl had called her early that morning, asking her to take a look at the horses. She hadn't been out this way in over a year, not since the last snowstorm nearly stranded her up by the pass. Grace stepped out, wiping her boots on the porch, bundled in a thick wool coat and red scarf. Her face had aged since Earl last saw her, but her eyes were still as sharp and kind as ever. "You rescuing strays now?" she asked with a soft smile as they walked toward the barn. "They found me," Earl muttered. Grace examined the horses carefully, checking their hooves, teeth, and weight. "They've been out there a while," she said, brushing snow from Luna's mane. "But they're not wild. Someone was caring for them, not long ago either." Earl nodded, not ready to share what he'd found in the snow. "Not yet." Then Grace paused, fingers tracing the faint scar across Whisper's shoulder. "This mare, she's been branded. But it's been burned off. Sloppy job. Whoever did it didn't want her traced." Earl's stomach dropped. That night, the ranch grew eerily quiet again. The wind died completely, and the cold deepened. Earl sat on the porch, wrapped in Mabel's old blanket, his rifle resting beside the chair. Something had shifted, not just in the snow, but in the air, in the feel of the land. And just before midnight, he saw it, a shadow moving at the tree line. Too big to be a deer. Too slow to be wind. Someone was out there, watching. Earl didn't move right away. He watched the shadow shift between the trees, tall and slow, like it had no reason to hide. His fingers curled around the stock of the old Winchester resting against his leg. He hadn't fired it in years, but the weight of it still felt familiar. The kind of familiarity that never really leaves a man. He stood slowly, careful not to make a sound, his boots silent against the frost-covered porch. The figure paused, then turned back into the trees, disappearing as quietly as it had come. But Earl had seen enough. He wasn't imagining things. Someone was watching the ranch. The next morning, he walked the perimeter. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. Whoever it was had been careful, or maybe the wind had erased the tracks. Either way, it didn't sit right. Whisper was uneasy too, pacing, ears perked, tail twitching in short jerks. Buck and Luna stayed close to her, sensing her tension. Earl rubbed his gloved hand along Whisper's neck, more for his own comfort than hers. "What kind of trouble followed you here, girl?" he whispered. She didn't respond, of course, but her eyes held something. Something alert, watchful. Like she remembered that shadow too. Inside the house, Earl opened the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. He hadn't touched it in years. Mabel's quilt was still folded neatly on top. Beneath it, wrapped in cloth, were the letters, old, yellowed envelopes tied with a frayed ribbon. Most were from Clint, before things went bad. The last one, though, was from someone else. Royce. Earl hadn't read it in decades, but now, he needed answers. He unfolded the brittle paper and read it slowly. The words were short, bitter, unfinished, something about unfinished business, about a reckoning. It made his stomach twist. Was that what this was? He drove into town again, but not to the sheriff this time. He stopped at the diner. Grace was there, sitting alone at a window booth with a notebook open and a coffee going cold. Earl slid into the seat across from her. "You ever hear of anyone using Royce Denton's old brand again?" he asked. She looked up slowly, brow furrowed. "No," she said, "but someone's been asking around about your ranch." Earl stiffened. "Who?" She shook her head. "Stranger. Didn't give a name. Asked if the old man who lived out past Denton's land still kept horses. Then he left." That night, Earl locked the barn. For the first time in years, he slid the heavy wood beam across the inside of the door. Whisper didn't protest. Luna curled close to Buck. Earl sat in the stall with them, the rifle across his knees, staring into the dark. There was something coming. He could feel it in his bones. Not just a visitor. Something older. Something unfinished. And somewhere deep in the woods, a voice whispered his name. Earl barely slept that night. The wind had dropped to nothing, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like something was waiting. He sat in the barn until dawn, rifle resting across his lap, boots planted firm in the hay. Whisper remained alert, eyes never straying far from the barn door. Buck and Luna shifted nervously in their stalls. Earl kept thinking about that letter from Royce, the one he'd buried at the bottom of Mabel's cedar chest. The words reckoning and unfinished business echoed louder with every hour that passed. Royce had been a violent man, driven by pride, anger, and something meaner than either. And now, after all these years, his shadow was crawling back across the land. By mid-morning, Earl decided it was time to stop waiting. He saddled up Whisper, gently but firmly. She resisted at first. It had probably been years since anyone had ridden her, but eventually she allowed it. He left Buck and Luna inside, the barn locked tight behind him. The cold air stung his face as he guided Whisper up the old trail behind the ridge, toward what was left of the Denton property. Snow crunched beneath her hooves. The ride was quiet, solemn. Earl's heart beat heavy in his chest. Every tree felt like a sentry. Every gust of wind carried a memory he didn't want. The Denton land looked worse than he remembered. The house was gone, just a blackened stone chimney rising crooked out of the snow. Metal scraps rusted in the weeds. But something new was there too. Boot prints. Fresh. Leading straight to the old barn at the back of the property. Earl dismounted, rifle in hand, and followed the trail. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, a sleeping bag, empty cans of beans, a half-burned fire pit, and hanging on the far wall, a rope with a rusted branding iron. It was Royce's brand. He backed out slowly, heart racing. Someone was staying here. Recently. Someone who didn't want to be seen. He turned to whisper, ready to head home, but froze. A man stood by the tree-line. Medium build, thick coat, face covered by a scarf and cap. Watching. Not moving. Earl raised the rifle, not aiming, but warning. The man didn't flinch. Just stared. Then, without a word, turned and disappeared into the trees. Earl rode home fast, his pulse thudding in his ears. Grace's words rang in his head, someone asking about the ranch. Whoever this was, he wasn't just passing through. He was here for something. And Earl's gut told him it had to do with that fire. With Royce. With whatever truth had been buried that night, decades ago. He had tried to forget it. To bury it alongside the old man's name. But it was clawing its way back now, step by step. And Earl knew he wouldn't be able to hide from it much longer. The sky over the ranch turned a pale steel gray by late afternoon, the kind of sky that promised another snowstorm by nightfall. Earl stood on the porch, looking out toward the tree line where the stranger had vanished. He hadn't told Sheriff Bodie yet, not about the fresh prints, the makeshift camp, or the branding iron. Something inside him still resisted reaching for help. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was guilt. He wasn't sure anymore. Whisper grazed quietly near the barn, but every so often, she'd lift her head and stare at the trees, ears twitching. Like she knew the past wasn't done with them yet. Inside, Earl sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the old letter from Royce again. The handwriting was sloppy, almost angry, as if it had been written in a rush, maybe even drunk. But one sentence stood out now more than ever. You think it's over, but it ain't. You buried one fire and left another burnin'. Earl didn't know what Royce meant back then. But now, after seeing the man at the tree line and that branding iron, he began to wonder if Royce had a son. Someone no one knew about. Someone who'd spent 30 years growing up in the shadow of a man like that. Angry, quiet, planning. Earl opened the small box where he kept family papers and dug out something he hadn't looked at in years. A folded letter addressed to Clint, his son. It had never been sent. Earl had written it 2 weeks after Mabel's funeral, when the silence in the house had become unbearable. But pride, that same stubborn pride, kept him from mailing it. Clint had left town after the fire, bitter and blaming Earl for things never spoken out loud. Things about Mabel. About the way she had looked at Royce once, years before the fire. Earl had never asked, never wanted to know. But Clint had always sensed something unspoken. The letter was short. An apology without explanation. A reach across the silence. And now, reading it again, Earl felt the weight of all the time lost. He thought about calling him Clint after all these years. But what would he say? Hey son, remember that man you hated me for? I think his ghost just walked across my land. It sounded ridiculous. But deep down, Earl knew he couldn't face whatever was coming alone. Not this time. That night, the storm rolled in harder than expected. Snow fell sideways, slamming against the windows, rattling the roof. Earl kept the horses inside, stoked the fire high, and locked every door. The air felt thick, not just with cold, but with history. With decisions. Outside, the wind howled like a warning. And then, just past midnight, someone knocked on the front door. Not hard. Not frantic. Just once. like they'd been waiting their whole life to be heard. The knock echoed through the small farmhouse like a memory come to life. Earl froze, hand tightening around the rifle, leaning against the wall. The storm howled outside, wind driving snow against the windows in thick waves. Whoever was out there hadn't knocked again. Just once, like they knew he'd come. Slowly, Earl moved to the door. His fingers hovered over the knob for a moment before he pulled it open. A man stood in the snow. Mid-30s, maybe a bit older, face half covered by a scarf and hood, but his eyes, cold, sharp, familiar, met Earl's with quiet fury. "You're Earl McKinney," the man said, voice low, flat. Not a question. A statement. Earl didn't answer at first. His eyes moved over the stranger's face, searching for something he couldn't name, and then he saw it. The jawline. The shape of the eyes. Royce Denton's face echoed in this younger man. His stomach dropped. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man continued. "I just need to talk." Earl stepped aside, still silent, motioning him in. The wind slammed the door shut behind them as the man pulled off his scarf and gloves. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his face, clothes damp and worn. "My name's Caleb Denton," he said. "Royce was my father." The name hit the room like a dropped hammer. Earl sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the rifle still within reach. Caleb stayed standing, pacing near the window. "I found his things 2 years ago," he said. "Buried in a storage shed up near Elko. Letters, maps, newspaper clippings. He wrote about you. About this ranch. About how everything went wrong." His voice was tight, bitter. "He died in that fire, didn't he? You just never told anyone." Earl stared into the steam rising from his coffee mug, heart pounding. He wanted to lie, to deny it. But the truth had been clawing its way to the surface for decades, and now it stood in his kitchen with his father's eyes. "Your father came here drunk," Earl said finally, voice low. "Mabel tried to send him away. He didn't listen. He grabbed her." Earl's jaw clenched. "I pulled him off her. He hit his head on the stove. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Caleb didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, fists tight at his sides. Then he turned slowly and looked at Earl. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Earl looked up, eyes tired, but steady. "Because no one would have believed me. And because part of me was afraid that I'd wanted him dead." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. It wasn't anger that filled the room now, it was the weight of knowing. Finally, Caleb nodded once and walked toward the door. "I'm not done with this," he said. "But I'm not here for revenge. I just needed the truth." Then he opened the door, letting the cold rush back in, and vanished into the snow. The door clicked shut behind Caleb, and Earl stood motionless for a long time, the wind cutting through the thin space between doorframe and weather stripping. The warmth of the house felt distant, almost meaningless. Caleb Denton had come and gone like a winter storm, brief, cold, and impossible to ignore. Earl sank into the old wooden chair by the window, heart pounding with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He had finally said it. The truth. The words that had rotted in his chest for decades. And now, spoken aloud, they didn't lift the guilt. If anything, they made it heavier. He sat there until morning, not sleeping, not speaking, just staring at the snow outside and thinking about the night of the fire. He remembered Mabel's voice, trembling but firm, telling him not to call the sheriff. "It'll ruin you," she'd said. "It'll ruin all of us." She had begged him to stay quiet, to protect their family. But silence didn't protect anything. It just buried the truth deeper. And now, after all these years, it had climbed out of the grave in the form of a man with his father's eyes and a broken legacy in his hands. When daylight finally pushed through the clouds, Earl went to the barn. Whisper stood near the door, quiet, steady. Buck and Luna were huddled in the straw. Earl moved slowly, patting each of them in turn, but it was Whisper he looked in the eye. "He knows," Earl whispered, "and I don't blame him." The mare blinked slowly, her breath warm against the cold air. There was something comforting about her stillness, like she had seen men fall and rise again, and none of it surprised her any more. Later that afternoon, Earl made a decision he'd put off for too long. He pulled out the old landline phone and dialed the number he used to know by heart. It rang 4 times before a tired voice answered. "Hello." It was Clint. Older. Hardened. Earl couldn't speak right away. He swallowed, his throat dry. "It's me," he finally said. Silence. Then Clint's voice, flat. "Didn't expect to hear from you." "I didn't expect to make it this long," Earl replied. Another pause. "What do you want?" Clint asked. Earl took a breath. "To tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. About your mother. About Royce Denton. About everything." They talked for 37 minutes. That night, Earl went out to the barn one more time. The wind was quiet. The sky clear for the first time in days. Stars stretched wide over the Nevada sky. As he leaned against the stall, Luna trotted over and nudged his side gently. Buck followed. Whisper stood at a distance, watching with that same unreadable calm. Earl felt something shift inside. Not peace, not yet. But something close, like the edge of forgiveness. And far off under the trees, he thought he saw Caleb, standing still, just watching. 3 days passed with no sign of Caleb Denton. The snow came and went, melting slightly in the afternoon sun and freezing again by nightfall. Earl kept the horses fed and the barn warm, moving slower than usual, his mind heavy but quieter. He found himself checking the tree line now and then, not out of fear, but out of something else. Expectation. Hope, maybe. But mostly, he just kept thinking about the phone call with Clint. How hard it had been to say the words. And how strange it felt to finally be heard. Clint hadn't forgiven him. Not exactly. But he had listened. And near the end of the call, when Earl said he'd understand if he never wanted to speak again, Clint simply said, "I'll think about it." That was more than Earl expected. Maybe more than he deserved. But it was something. And now, every time the phone rang, a small part of him hoped it would be Clint calling back. Not for explanations. Just for something simple. Like asking how the horses were. Or what the sky looked like over the ranch that day. On the 4th morning, Earl found a note tucked into the latch of the barn door. No name, no greeting. Just 10 words, written in clean block letters. "He was my father. But you were right to stop him." Earl stared at it for a long time, the wind catching the corners of the paper. It was Caleb's writing, no doubt in his mind. And in those 10 words, Earl felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness, but understanding. And that was more than he thought he'd ever get. He folded the note carefully and placed it inside the same box where Mabel's letters rested. A new piece of the past, finally set down where it belonged. That afternoon, Earl walked to the edge of the property, the old fence line where the Denton land began. The wire was rusted, half buried in snow. Beyond it, the trees stood tall and still. He didn't say anything out loud. Just stood there for a while, remembering the fire, the fights, the silence that followed. The years lost. The lives changed. He had built a life out of avoiding that fence line. And now, for the first time in decades, he looked past it without flinching. When he returned to the barn, Whisper came to him right away. She nudged his shoulder gently, and Earl leaned into her without hesitation. Buck was galloping in small circles, Luna chasing after him, their energy full of life. Earl couldn't help but smile. Not because things were fixed, but because something new was beginning. These horses had brought with them the weight of his past, but they also carried the quiet promise of tomorrow. And for the first time in years, Earl opened the gate to let them run free. Spring came late to that part of Nevada. The snow took its time melting off the hills, and the nights stayed cold long into April. But something had changed at the McKinney ranch. The silence that used to press down on the land now felt different, less like grief, more like peace. Earl moved through his days slowly but with new purpose. He repaired the front gate, replaced the roof on the chicken coop, and even cleared out the old room that had belonged to Clint, dusting off boxes he'd left untouched for years. The horses had settled in completely. Buck had grown bolder, kicking up snow with playful pride, and Luna followed him everywhere, still gentle, still watchful. Whisper remained close to Earl, never straying too far from his side. She was more than just a horse to him now. She had become something else entirely. A quiet witness, a companion who had carried more than her share of memory and meaning. Every time he looked into her eyes, he felt it, a calm understanding. Like she knew this land better than he ever would. One morning, while hauling firewood to the shed, Earl heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned slowly, unsure what to expect. The old blue pickup that came into view was rusted along the sides but familiar in shape. It parked near the front porch. The engine cut off. A moment passed. Then the door opened, and Clint stepped out. Older, worn, but it was him. Earl stood still, breath caught in his throat. Clint didn't speak at first. He just looked around, at the barn, the trees, the open field. Then he said, "Heard you let the horses run." Earl nodded, his voice low. Figured it was time. A long pause hung between them. Then Clint walked closer. "Got your letter. Read it 3 times before I believed it was really from you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded photograph. He handed it to Earl. It was Mabel, young, smiling, standing next to a horse that looked a lot like Whisper. Earl's hand trembled slightly as he held it. "She would have wanted this," Clint said. They didn't say much after that. They sat on the porch, side by side, sharing coffee and silence, letting the past settle without pushing it away. As the sun lowered behind the distant mountains, Buck and Luna ran along the fence line, their manes catching the light. Whisper stood still, ears turned toward the porch, as if listening. Earl leaned back in the rocking chair Mabel once used. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "I thought those horses came here lost. But maybe they came to find me." Clint didn't answer right away. Then he simply said, "Looks like they did." And as the sky turned gold and the wind settled across the field, Earl McKinney finally felt the weight in his chest lift. Slowly, fully, for the first time in a very long time.